It's a pleasure to help launch Votes for Women 100. As an historian of the women's suffrage movement, I'm impressed by the thoughtful and thought-provoking program the Persistence Theater have put together to celebrate this 100th anniversary of the first time women voted in any public election in Newfoundland. I'm also personally delighted at this series because I had an aunt and a grandmother who were involved, and it's wonderful to see this generation of activists remembered again. You know, history rarely records a transformative leap in human rights. Instead, it's the determined strides of generation after generation of activists that move us forward to a more perfect society. A stepping stone to greater things is how Armine Gosling, the suffrage leader, described this vote in St. John's. Propertied women won the right to vote in city elections. Yes, it was just that, a stepping stone. But it was one that suffragists had reached with enormous difficulty. They'd started to campaign for votes for women, first on temperance in the 1890s. Oh, what a fuss they stirred up. There was mockery that they were unsexing themselves by entering the masculine sphere of politics. There were dire warnings, including from the pulpit, that these ungodly harridans were creating a racket over nothing. Now, the irony is that many of these same women led church groups. They were defying their divinely ordered place in the home, so it was said. There were sobering predictions, including in the legislature, that families would be torn apart by political squabbling if women had a say. Opponents worked themselves up into quite a dither, we can say, in retrospect. Votes for women owning property. Now, this conjures up a vision of affluence and wealth. And indeed, the first woman to vote in any election, public election, in Newfoundland was Mary Pitts, a wealthy widow who had a spacious and beautiful house on Kingsbridge Road. In fact, it still stands. And she was driven to the polls by her coachman, Jim Diamond, by a coach and fours. He and his wife, Lily, were among her servants. Yet this image is completely deceptive. Scratch the surface and we see that this image is very misleading. The vast majority of women who voted on December 15th, 1921, were widows like Mrs. Pitts. Some lived in mansions, others lived in very modest houses, and some lived in the slums surrounding what is now the St. John's headquarters, City Hall. The vast majority of female voters were widows, and their breadwinner was dead, and they were struggling alone. Only a handful of the first female voters were women of independent means. There were a handful of single women owning millinery shops and small bakeries and corner stores, but very few single women, including teachers, those working in factories or those working in shops, had pay that was sufficient to buy a property. Yet women were so eager to vote that some bought sheds, and legend has it that some bought chicken coops in order to meet the property qualification. And when these women voters first flooded to the polls, they disproved the many skeptics. Social ruin, of course, didn't materialize. Mothers didn't terrify their children ranting about city bylaws. The Almighty didn't hurl the Southside Hills into the harbor, angered that male supremacy in the public sphere had been breached. What did happen was a clear demonstration that women were interested in voting. They wanted a say beyond the traditional four walls of their houses. They wanted reforms in the city, including enhanced child welfare, better attention to sanitation, and laws regulating the treatment of animals. But beyond these immediate and practical city issues, they also wanted to improve their lot in life. The vote to this generation was far more than a vote. To the suffragists, yes, it was a practical instrument and they intended to use it, but it was also a galvanizing symbol in a march towards women's equality. The 1921 St. John's victory propelled the activists forward after years of discouragement. They demanded more. They launched a 5-year campaign and they were successful. It was a campaign for women in Newfoundland to vote without property limitations, and in 1925 they won. However, and it is a big however, it should also be acknowledged that men and women in Labrador as a whole remained neglected, and Indigenous voting rights in general were ignored. With the wisdom of hindsight, 100 years later, we can see this earlier generation had limitations in their vision of inclusion. We're all influenced by our times, and that's a thought that I find personally sobering. With all this in mind, Persistence Theatre is sponsoring an ambitious program. We're asked to reflect upon the women's suffrage movement through a series of 6 short plays, followed by panel discussions, and to demand action on current issues through a Votes for Women 100 march. And we'll have an opportunity to consider how Armine Gosling, in some ways an ordinary woman and an extraordinary woman at the same time, how Armine Gosling summoned the courage to defy centuries of tradition in a stellar full-length play by Trudy Morgan Cole called The Mirror. We'll also honor this generation of activists by fundraising for a statue of one of them, Armine Gosling, both for her own sake, but also as representative of a brave generation, a statue that we hope will be a stepping stone to a more balanced and inclusive public history of the province. The journey to full equality and justice goes on. The terrain at times is uneven. The cliffs seem high, and contrary seas, like a horrible budget, can roar. But 100 years later, the many people who care about a just society, with no exceptions, are not discouraged. We have companions, long past and very much present with us along the way. And so, in this spirit, let the Votes for Women 100 conversation and actions begin. And thank you again, Persistence Theatre Company, from the bottom of my heart for the opportunity to help launch this celebration.